The crystal tumbler was halfway to his lips when a soft voice reached him from across the marble-floored study. "Non bere quello," she whispered urgently in Italian, her words barely audible above the crackling fireplace. Vincent Ashford's hand froze in midair, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as his eyes snapped toward the figure dusting his antique bookshelf. For a moment, time seemed suspended in the opulent room, the weight of her warning hanging between them like a physical presence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lucia Benedetti had been invisible to him for the past 18 months, just another face among the rotating staff who maintained his Beverly Hills estate. Yet something in her tone, the genuine fear threading through her accented English, made his blood run cold. The woman who had silently cleaned around him, who he had dismissed as just another undocumented worker grateful for employment, had just potentially saved his life. The events that led to this moment had begun 4 days earlier when Vincent Ashford made what he believed would be the most profitable decision of his career. At 62, the pharmaceutical mogul had built Meridian Industries from a small research lab into a billion-dollar empire. But his latest acquisition was about to test every principle he thought he understood about power, loyalty, and the people who serve in the shadows of wealth. Vincent had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses and exploit them for business advantage. It was this skill that had allowed him to corner markets, crush competitors, and accumulate a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest men in California. His estate overlooked the city like a fortress, its sprawling grounds maintained by a staff of 22 employees, most of whom he couldn't be bothered to learn by name. Lucia Benedetti was one of these nameless faces, hired through an agency that specialized in discreet domestic help for high-profile clients. Her references were impeccable, her English adequate, and her presence so unobtrusive that Vincent often forgot she was in the room. She arrived each morning at 6, completed her assigned tasks with meticulous attention to detail, and departed each evening at 4 without ever speaking unless directly addressed. What Vincent didn't know was that Lucia possessed a doctorate in biochemistry from the University of Bologna and had spent 15 years working for pharmaceutical companies across Europe before circumstances beyond her control had forced her to flee to America. Her immigration status was complicated, her credentials unrecognized in the United States, and her need for income desperate enough that she had accepted domestic work to survive while navigating the complex process of legal residency. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Vincent sat in his study reviewing quarterly reports when his personal assistant, Margaret Chen, entered with news that would electrify his competitive instincts. Helix Pharmaceuticals, a mid-sized company that had been developing a revolutionary cancer treatment, was facing sudden financial difficulties following the death of their primary investor. "They're looking for emergency funding," Margaret explained, her voice carefully neutral as she placed a thick folder on his mahogany desk. "The treatment has shown remarkable results in clinical trials, but they need $50 million immediately, or they'll have to shut down research entirely." Vincent's eyes gleamed as he scanned the financial projections. Helix's desperation created the perfect opportunity for a hostile acquisition disguised as a rescue investment. He could swoop in as their savior, gain controlling interest at a fraction of the company's actual value, and then gut their research department to eliminate competition with his own cancer drug development. "Set up a meeting with their board," he instructed. "Margaret, I want this wrapped up within the week." What Vincent failed to notice was Lucia quietly dusting the ornate lamp beside his desk, her movements perfectly synchronized with his conversation to avoid drawing attention. Her English might be limited in casual conversation, but her scientific vocabulary was extensive, and every word of his ruthless plan registered with growing horror. Helix Pharmaceuticals wasn't just another company to Lucia. Her younger brother, Marco, was dying of the exact type of cancer their experimental treatment was designed to combat. She had been following their research through scientific journals and medical databases, clinging to the hope that their breakthrough therapy might save him. The thought of Vincent destroying that hope for profit made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to continue her work, her face a mask of polite indifference. Over the next 3 days, Vincent's acquisition strategy unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. He studied Helix's financial records, identified their most vulnerable board members, and crafted an offer that appeared generous while containing clauses that would give him complete control within 6 months. His lawyers worked around the clock to prepare contracts that would be difficult to refuse and impossible to escape. Throughout this process, Lucia observed everything. Vincent's habit of conducting sensitive phone calls while she cleaned allowed her to piece together the full scope of his plan. He intended to acquire Helix, shut down their cancer research, and redirect their resources toward developing cosmetic pharmaceutical products that would generate higher profit margins. The treatment that could save thousands of lives, including her brother's, would be buried forever. Lucia found herself facing an impossible moral dilemma. Speaking out would expose her eavesdropping and likely result in immediate termination and possible deportation. Remaining silent would make her complicit in condemning her brother and countless other patients to death. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her as she moved through her daily routine, cleaning around Vincent while he orchestrated what she saw as an act of medical genocide. The breakthrough came on Wednesday evening when Vincent celebrated his impending victory with several associates in his private dining room. Lucia was clearing plates when she overheard a conversation that revealed the final piece of his strategy. Vincent had discovered that Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, Helix's lead researcher and the brilliant mind behind their cancer treatment, was planning to quit rather than see her life's work destroyed. "She's the only one who truly understands the treatment protocol," Vincent was explaining to his guest, pharmaceutical executive David Kellerman. "Without her, even if another company tries to continue the research, they'll be starting from scratch. It would take years to replicate her work." David nodded approvingly. "Eliminating competition before it can flourish. Brilliant strategy, Vincent." "The best part," Vincent continued, swirling his wine, "is that she has no idea what's coming. By the time she realizes her research is being terminated, it will be too late to salvage anything." Lucia's hands trembled as she collected the dinner plates, her mind racing with the implications. Dr. Morgan was reportedly on the verge of a major breakthrough that could make the treatment even more effective. If Vincent succeeded in his acquisition, not only would current cancer patients lose hope, but future generations would be denied potentially life-saving advances. That night, Lucia sat in her small apartment staring at a photograph of Marco, his face gaunt from chemotherapy but his eyes still holding the spark of determination that had carried him through 3 years of fighting his disease. She thought about Dr. Morgan, working tirelessly in her laboratory, unaware that her years of dedication were about to be rendered meaningless by corporate greed. She thought about the thousands of patients worldwide who are counting on treatments that might never see the light of day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By morning, Lucia had made her decision. She couldn't expose Vincent's plan directly without destroying her own precarious situation, but perhaps she could find another way to ensure justice was served. Vincent's meeting with the Helix board was scheduled for Friday afternoon. The contracts were prepared, the financial arrangements finalized, and his team of lawyers stood ready to complete what would be one of the most profitable acquisitions in Meridian Industries' history. Vincent felt the familiar rush of impending victory as he prepared for the meeting that would eliminate a major competitor while appearing to rescue a struggling company. What he didn't anticipate was that Lucia had spent Thursday night researching everything she could find about the Helix board members, their backgrounds, and their personal connections to cancer research. Dr. Sarah Williams, the board chairwoman, had lost her husband to the same type of cancer that Marco was fighting. Board member Professor James Harrison had published papers on medical ethics that specifically condemned the practice of acquiring promising research solely to suppress it. Lucia also discovered something that Vincent's extensive due diligence had missed. Dr. Morgan had recently been approached by a consortium of European pharmaceutical companies who were interested in licensing her research for international development. The consortium's offer was lower than Vincent's, but it would allow the research to continue under Dr. Morgan's supervision. Armed with this knowledge, Lucia faced another ethical crossroads. She possessed information that could potentially save the research, but using it would require her to take risks that could expose her illegal immigration status and result in immediate deportation back to Italy, where she would be unable to help Marco access American cancer treatments that were keeping him alive. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Vincent's increasingly confident mood as he reviewed his acquisition strategy one final time. The Helix board would meet at 2 o'clock, and by evening, he would control their revolutionary cancer treatment. His plan was foolproof, his position unassailable, and his victory assured. Lucia arrived for work that morning carrying a weight of responsibility that seemed to press down on her shoulders with each step. She had made her choice, but executing it would require perfect timing and a level of courage she wasn't certain she possessed. As she began her morning cleaning routine, she noticed that Vincent had left several documents related to the Helix acquisition scattered across his desk. Among these papers was a confidential memo that made her blood run cold. Vincent's post-acquisition plan was even more ruthless than she had realized. He intended not only to shut down the cancer research, but also to file patents on Dr. Morgan's preliminary findings, effectively preventing any other company from developing similar treatments for at least 20 years. The legal maneuver would create a monopoly that could delay life-saving cancer treatments for an entire generation. The memo also revealed Vincent's contingency plan if Dr. Morgan refused to cooperate with the acquisition. He had prepared a campaign to discredit her research, questioning its validity and safety in ways that would make it nearly impossible for her to secure funding elsewhere. Vincent wasn't just planning to destroy the current research, he was preparing to destroy Dr. Morgan's career and reputation to ensure she could never threaten his market position again. Lucia photographed the memo with her phone, her hands shaking as she realized the full scope of Vincent's calculated cruelty. This wasn't simply aggressive business practice, it was a deliberate attempt to monopolize cancer treatment in ways that would condemn thousands of patients to preventable deaths. As Vincent prepared to leave for his meeting with the Helix board, Lucia made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. She approached Margaret Chen's desk while the assistant was away from her station and quickly accessed her computer. Using credentials she had observed Margaret enter countless times while cleaning nearby. Working with the speed and precision of someone whose life depended on not being caught, Lucia composed an email that she sent to Dr. Elizabeth Morgan directly. The message was carefully crafted to appear as though it came from a concerned insider at Meridian Industries who wished to remain anonymous. It contained detailed information about Vincent's true intentions, his plans to terminate the cancer research, and his strategy to prevent Dr. Morgan from continuing her work elsewhere. The email also included information about the European consortium's interest in licensing the research, along with contact details that Lucia had researched the night before. Most importantly, it warned Dr. Morgan that she had less than 2 hours before Vincent's acquisition would make it impossible for her to explore alternative arrangements. Lucia deleted all traces of the email from Margaret's computer and returned to her cleaning duties, her heart pounding as she waited to see if her intervention would have any effect. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, but the image of Marco's face and the thought of thousands of other patients facing similar battles gave her the strength to accept whatever consequences might follow. Vincent departed for his meeting at 1:30, his confidence radiating through the estate like a physical force. He had spent months orchestrating this acquisition, and nothing could possibly go wrong at this late stage. His team of lawyers followed him in a separate car, their briefcases filled with contracts that would give him complete control over Helix's revolutionary research. The Helix Pharmaceuticals building stood in stark contrast to Vincent's opulent estate. The modest research facility reflected a company focused on scientific advancement rather than executive luxury. Dr. Morgan's laboratory occupied the entire 3rd floor, its walls lined with complex equipment and detailed charts tracking patient responses to various treatment protocols. When Vincent arrived, he was surprised to find the board meeting already in progress. Dr. Morgan sat at the head of the conference table, her usually reserved demeanor replaced by an intensity that filled the room. The board members wore expressions of grim determination rather than the desperate gratitude Vincent had expected. "Mr. Ashford," Dr. Williams said as he entered the conference room, "please have a seat. We have some questions about your proposed acquisition." Vincent sensed immediately that something had shifted, but his years of business negotiations had taught him to never show uncertainty. "Of course," he replied smoothly, taking his seat at the polished table. "I'm prepared to address any concerns you might have." Dr. Morgan leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Vincent with laser-like focus. "We've received some disturbing information about your post-acquisition plans for our research. Would you care to explain your intentions regarding the continuation of our cancer treatment development?" Vincent felt a flicker of unease but maintained his composed facade. Naturally, we would conduct a thorough review of all ongoing projects to ensure they align with Meridian's strategic objectives and safety standards. That's not what we asked, Professor Harrison interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to exposing evasion in academic settings. We've been informed that you plan to terminate our cancer research entirely and file patents to prevent other companies from continuing similar work. The room fell silent as Vincent processed the implications of Harrison's statement. Someone had betrayed his confidential plans, but who could have accessed such detailed information? His acquisition strategy had been discussed only with his most trusted associates, and all relevant documents were secured in his private study. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed," Vincent said carefully, his mind racing to identify the source of the leak. Meridian Industries has always been committed to advancing medical research that serves the public good. Dr. Morgan placed a printed email on the table in front of him. This communication suggests otherwise. It contains specific details about your plans that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of your strategy. Vincent scanned the email, his face growing pale as he recognized direct quotes from his private memos and conversations. The sender was listed as a concerned colleague, but the information was so detailed and accurate that it could only have come from someone with access to his most confidential files. Furthermore, Dr. Williams continued, we've been contacted by a European pharmaceutical consortium that has offered to license our research while allowing Dr. Morgan to continue her work independently. Their terms are more favorable to our mission of developing accessible cancer treatments. Vincent's carefully constructed acquisition began crumbling around him as the board members peppered him with questions that exposed the predatory nature of his offer. His lawyers shuffled papers nervously as it became clear that their meticulously crafted contracts would not be signed today, if ever. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Vincent said, attempting to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we could postpone this meeting to allow me to address these concerns properly." "There's no misunderstanding," Dr. Morgan replied firmly. "We know exactly what you intended to do with our research, and we will not be party to denying cancer patients access to potentially life-saving treatments." The meeting concluded with Vincent's humiliating departure, his acquisition dead in the water, and his reputation within the pharmaceutical industry severely damaged. Word of his failed hostile takeover attempt would spread quickly through the tight-knit community of medical researchers, making future acquisitions much more difficult. As Vincent drove back to his estate, his mind churned with questions about who could have betrayed him. The leak had come from someone with access to his private study, someone who had observed his most confidential conversations and had access to documents that never left his desk. The realization that his own home had been compromised filled him with a rage that burned hotter than his professional embarrassment. Lucia was dusting the living room when Vincent stormed through the front door, his face flushed with anger and his usual composure completely shattered. She kept her expression neutral as he stalked past her toward his study, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she wondered if he suspected her involvement. Vincent spent the evening in his study, reviewing every document related to the Helix acquisition and trying to determine how his confidential information had been compromised. His security system showed no signs of unauthorized access, his computer passwords remained intact, and his trusted associates all denied any knowledge of how his plans had been exposed. The answer came to him gradually as he recalled the various conversations he had conducted while his domestic staff worked around him. He remembered Lucia's presence during phone calls, her quiet efficiency as she cleaned while he discussed sensitive business matters, her seemingly limited English that had made him comfortable speaking freely in her presence. But if Lucia was responsible for the leak, it meant she understood far more English than she had ever let on. It meant she had been deliberately deceiving him about her capabilities, while gathering information that she had ultimately used to destroy his most important business deal. The thought that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as merely hired help filled Vincent with a fury that bordered on obsession. He began planning his revenge, determined to expose her deception and ensure she faced the full consequences of her betrayal. As Vincent plotted in his study, Lucia completed her evening cleaning routine with the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her conscience. She had saved Dr. Morgan's research and potentially countless lives, but she had also declared war on one of the most powerful men in the pharmaceutical industry. The consequences of that conflict would soon reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully anticipate. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again. Dr. Morgan's research had received emergency funding from the European Consortium, ensuring that her cancer treatment development would continue uninterrupted. The story of Vincent's failed acquisition attempt was already spreading through industry publications, painting him as a ruthless opportunist who had tried to exploit a humanitarian medical crisis for personal profit. But Vincent's humiliation was far from over. The anonymous email that had exposed his plans had also been forwarded to several medical ethics boards and patient advocacy groups. His reputation within the pharmaceutical industry was beginning to crumble as the full scope of his intended monopolization became public knowledge. Lucia arrived for work that morning, knowing that her time in Vincent's employ was probably measured in hours rather than days. His suspicious glances and barely contained rage told her that he was beginning to piece together her role in his downfall. She had accepted this inevitable consequence when she decided to act, but she wasn't prepared for what Vincent had planned as retaliation. As she cleaned his study that morning, Vincent sat behind his desk watching her every movement with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. When she reached for his coffee cup to clean the ring it had left on his desk, he spoke for the first time in weeks. "Your English seems to be improving, Lucia," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made her freeze in place. "Grazie, Signor Ashford," she replied carefully, maintaining the limited vocabulary she had always used in his presence. "I'm curious," Vincent continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "How much of our business discussions have you actually understood over the past 18 months? Lucia kept her expression neutral despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Non capisco molto bene, signore. My English is not so good." Vincent's smile was cold as winter rain. "We'll see about that." That afternoon, Vincent implemented a plan designed to expose Lucia's deception and destroy her life as thoroughly as she had destroyed his business deal. He began by calling the immigration authorities to report his suspicions about her documentation status. Then he contacted the domestic employment agency that had recommended her, raising questions about the authenticity of her references and background check. But Vincent's most devastating move was yet to come. He had discovered through his pharmaceutical industry contacts that Marco Benedetti, Lucia's brother, was receiving experimental cancer treatment at a research hospital in San Diego. The treatments were being provided through a compassionate use program that required the patient's family members to maintain stable employment and legal resident status. Vincent's plan was elegantly cruel in its simplicity. By exposing Lucia's immigration status and having her deported, he would not only punish her betrayal, but also ensure that her brother lost access to the experimental treatments that were keeping him alive. It was a level of revenge that went far beyond business retaliation, striking at the very heart of why she had acted against him in the first place. As Vincent set his revenge in motion, neither he nor Lucia realized that their conflict was about to take a turn that would expose secrets far more dangerous than corporate espionage or immigration fraud. The game they were playing had stakes higher than either of them understood, and the next move would come from a direction that neither had anticipated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the price of moral courage. And it would all begin with a simple glass of amber liquid and a whispered warning in Italian that would freeze time itself. In Vincent Ashford's opulent study, the immigration officers arrived at Vincent's estate on Tuesday morning with documentation that would have destroyed Lucia's life if events had unfolded as he intended. Agent Patricia Morrison carried papers that would classify Lucia as an undocumented worker subject to immediate detention and deportation, while Agent Kevin Walsh held a warrant to search her belongings for evidence of fraudulent documentation. Vincent watched from his study window as their unmarked sedan parked in his circular driveway, satisfaction coursing through him like a drug. What Vincent didn't know was that his revenge had triggered a chain of events involving people far more dangerous than a desperate immigrant trying to save her brother's life. Dr. Morgan's research wasn't just promising. It threatened to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the pharmaceutical industry, including companies that Vincent had business relationships with for over 2 decades. Lucia was arranging fresh flowers in the main foyer when she spotted the federal agents approaching the front door. Her hands trembled as she set down the crystal vase, recognizing immediately what their presence meant. Vincent had discovered her role in exposing his Helix acquisition and was now orchestrating her destruction with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to business negotiations. Margaret Chen answered the door with her usual professional courtesy, unaware that she was welcoming agents who would reshape the dynamics of the entire household. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "We're here to speak with Lucia Benedetti regarding her employment status," Agent Morrison explained, her badge glinting in the morning sunlight. "We understand she works as domestic help for Mr. Ashford." "Certainly. Please come in." Margaret's voice remained steady, but Lucia could see the concern flickering across her features as she led the agents into the foyer. Vincent emerged from his study with theatrical timing, his expression carefully crafted to suggest surprised cooperation rather than vindictive satisfaction. "Officers, I hope there isn't any trouble. Ms. Benedetti has been a reliable employee, though I must admit I've sometimes wondered about her documentation." Agent Walsh consulted his notepad. "We've received reports suggesting she may be working under fraudulent papers. We'll need to conduct an interview and examine her employment records." As the agent spoke with Vincent, Lucia found herself facing a moment that would define the rest of her life. She could submit to deportation and accept that her brother would lose access to the treatments keeping him alive, or she could reveal information that might save both their lives while exposing her to dangers she had never imagined. The decision was made for her when Agent Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent message. "All units be advised, we have a priority directive from Washington regarding subjects connected to pharmaceutical research security. Any immigration cases involving individuals with access to medical industry information are to be handled with extreme caution." Vincent's confidence flickered as he processed the implications of the radio message. His attempt to use immigration enforcement as a personal revenge tool had apparently intersected with federal investigations far beyond his understanding. Agent Morrison stepped away to take a private phone call while Agent Walsh continued questioning Vincent about Lucia's employment history. The conversation Vincent had eagerly anticipated was taking an unexpected direction, with the agents showing more interest in his business relationships than in Lucia's documentation status. "Mr. Ashford," Agent Walsh said, consulting his notes, "we understand you recently attempted to acquire Helix Pharmaceuticals. Can you describe the nature of that business relationship?" Vincent felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. It was a standard acquisition proposal, nothing unusual about the transaction. "Our records suggest the acquisition was terminated after confidential information about your intentions was leaked to the target company. Do you have any theories about who might have had access to such sensitive information?" Quote, the trap Vincent had set for Lucia was beginning to close around him instead. His accusations against her would require him to admit that she had access to confidential business information, which would raise questions about his own security practices and the nature of the sensitive discussions she might have overheard. Agent Morrison returned from her phone call with an expression that made everyone in the foyer tense. "Mr. Ashford, we're going to need to expand our investigation. We have reason to believe that your employee may have information relevant to a federal investigation into pharmaceutical industry practices." Vincent's world tilted on its axis as he realized that his revenge plot had attracted the attention of federal authorities investigating exactly the kind of business practices he had built his fortune on. Lucia wasn't just a domestic worker who had betrayed him. She was potentially a federal witness whose testimony could expose decades of questionable pharmaceutical industry practices. "I think there may be some confusion," Vincent said carefully. "Ms. Benedetti is simply domestic help. She wouldn't have access to any information relevant to pharmaceutical investigations." Agent Morrison's smile was razor-sharp. "That's interesting, because our intelligence suggests otherwise. We understand she may have witnessed conversations and accessed documents related to practices that are currently under federal scrutiny." Lucia realized that the agents weren't here to deport her. They were here to recruit her as a witness in an investigation that apparently involved Vincent's business practices. The immigration threat that had terrified her moments earlier was transforming into an opportunity that could protect both her and Marco, while potentially bringing justice to an industry she had watched exploit desperate patients for profit. "I would like to speak with these agents privately," Lucia said in clear, unaccented English that made Vincent's face drain of color. "I believe I have information that would be valuable to their investigation." The transformation was instant and devastating. The woman Vincent had dismissed as barely literate was speaking with the precision and vocabulary of someone with advanced education. Her posture straightened, her expression sharpened, and her entire presence commanded attention in a way that made her previous invisibility seem impossible. Vincent stared at her in shock as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. For 18 months, he had been conducting sensitive business while being observed by someone whose intelligence and education he had catastrophically underestimated. Every confidential phone call, every strategic discussion, every document left carelessly on his desk had been absorbed by someone who understood their implications far better than he had ever suspected. Agent Morrison nodded approvingly. "Dr. Benedetti, we've been hoping to speak with you. Your credentials from the University of Bologna and your work history with European pharmaceutical companies make you uniquely qualified to help us understand certain practices we're investigating." The title hit Vincent like a physical blow. Lucia wasn't just educated, she was Dr. Lucia Benedetti, a biochemist whose qualifications surpassed his own understanding of pharmaceutical science. He had been condescended to and outmaneuvered by someone whose expertise in the field exceeded that of most of his own research staff. "My immigration status," Lucia began, but Agent Morrison waved away her concern, "is being handled through witness protection protocols. Your cooperation with our investigation will ensure that you and your brother receive all necessary protections and support." Vincent watched his carefully orchestrated revenge crumble into catastrophic exposure as Lucia began describing to the agents what she had observed. During her employment, her testimony painted a picture of pharmaceutical industry practices that went far beyond the Helix acquisition attempt, encompassing years of conversations about price manipulation, research suppression, and patient exploitation that she had witnessed while cleaning around him. The agents took detailed notes, as Lucia described Vincent's discussions about maintaining artificial scarcity in cancer treatments to maximize profits, his strategies for acquiring promising research solely to bury it, and his collaborations with other pharmaceutical executives to suppress generic drug development. Her scientific background allowed her to understand the technical discussions that would have been meaningless to most observers, while her perfect recall provided specific dates, names, and financial figures that corroborated federal investigations already in progress. As the morning progressed, Vincent realized that his attempt to destroy Lucia had instead delivered him into the hands of federal investigators who had been building cases against pharmaceutical industry executives for years. The immigration threat he had arranged was meaningless compared to the federal charges he now faced for practices that Lucia could describe in devastating detail. Agent Walsh handed Vincent a card. "Mr. Ashford, you'll want to contact your attorney. We'll be back tomorrow with additional questions about your business practices, and we recommend you prepare comprehensive documentation of your pharmaceutical industry transactions for the past 5 years." The agents departed with Lucia, who cast one final glance at Vincent before walking out of his estate as a protected federal witness rather than the undocumented worker he had tried to destroy. Her departure marked the end of his reign of terror over vulnerable employees and the beginning of accountability for decades of pharmaceutical industry exploitation. Vincent spent the remainder of Tuesday in emergency meetings with his legal team, who painted an increasingly grim picture of his situation. The federal investigation encompassed multiple pharmaceutical companies and covered practices spanning nearly a decade. Witness testimony from someone with Lucia's credentials and first-hand knowledge of his business operations could result in criminal charges that would destroy both his company and his personal freedom. The evening news carried a story that made Vincent's situation even worse. The European consortium had announced breakthrough results from Dr. Morgan's cancer research, with early trials showing effectiveness rates that far exceeded previous treatments. The research that Vincent had tried to bury was now being hailed as a potential cure for several types of cancer, making his suppression attempt appear not just greedy but criminally negligent. Medical ethics boards began launching investigations into Vincent's business practices, while patient advocacy groups filed lawsuits alleging that his market manipulation had delayed life-saving treatments and resulted in preventable deaths. The reputation he had spent decades building was collapsing under the weight of revelations that painted him as someone who prioritized profits over human lives. Wednesday morning brought a development that would change the trajectory of both Vincent's investigation and Lucia's protection status. Dr. Morgan called a press conference to announce that her research had received additional funding from the Italian government, specifically citing the contributions of Dr. Lucia Benedetti in exposing pharmaceutical industry practices that threatened medical research independence. Vincent watched the press conference from his study, his face ashen, as Dr. Morgan described how an anonymous tip from someone with pharmaceutical industry knowledge had saved her research from corporate suppression. The public recognition of Lucia's role as a whistleblower elevated her from a federal witness to an international symbol of resistance against pharmaceutical industry corruption. The publicity surrounding Lucia's whistleblowing activities attracted attention from investigative journalists who began digging deeper into Vincent's business practices. Within days, major newspapers were publishing exposés detailing his acquisition strategies, his role in suppressing generic drug development, and his collaboration with other executives to maintain artificial scarcity in essential medications. One particularly damaging article revealed that Vincent had been aware for years that faster development of generic cancer treatments could save thousands of lives annually, but had actively worked to delay such development to protect the profit margins of his proprietary drugs. The revelation sparked outrage from patient advocacy groups and led to congressional calls for pharmaceutical industry reform. As public pressure mounted, Vincent found himself facing a choice between accepting a plea bargain that would result in significant prison time and financial penalties, or fighting charges that could result in life imprisonment if he was convicted on all counts. His legal team recommended cooperation with federal investigators, arguing that his assistance in exposing industry-wide corruption might result in a more lenient sentence. The irony wasn't lost on Vincent that his salvation might depend on following the same path Lucia had chosen by exposing pharmaceutical industry practices that prioritized profits over patient welfare. The woman he had tried to destroy for her moral courage was now the model for his own potential redemption. Thursday evening brought the moment that would crystallize the true stakes of their conflict. Vincent sat in his study, reviewing plea bargain documents when Margaret Chen knocked on his door with unusual urgency. "Mr. Ashford, there's someone here to see you. She says it's important." Vincent looked up to see Lucia standing in his doorway, no longer dressed in her cleaning uniform but in professional attire that reflected her true status as an accomplished scientist. Her presence in his study as an equal rather than an employee created a surreal reversal of their previous dynamic. "Dr. Benedetti," Vincent said, his voice heavy with defeat. "I suppose you've come to witness my downfall." Lucia stepped into the room, her expression serious but not vindictive. "I've come to offer you something you never offered me, a chance to do the right thing." Vincent gestured to the plea bargain documents scattered across his desk. "I'm already cooperating with federal investigators. My attorneys tell me it's my only hope of avoiding life imprisonment." "Cooperation born of desperation isn't the same as choosing to act ethically," Lucia replied. "You have an opportunity to use your knowledge and connections to expose practices that are killing patients across the industry. You can choose to be part of the solution instead of just trying to minimize your punishment." Vincent studied her face, searching for signs of the calculating revenge he would have pursued in her position. Instead, he saw the same moral clarity that had driven her to expose his Helix acquisition despite the personal risks involved. "Why would you want to help me after what I tried to do to you?" Vincent asked. "Because this was never about personal revenge," Lucia answered. "It was about preventing the suppression of treatments that could save lives. You have information that could expose practices throughout the industry and force reforms that would help millions of patients. Your choice is whether to use that information to serve justice or just to serve yourself." Vincent realized that Lucia was offering him the same opportunity for moral redemption that she had chosen when she decided to expose his Helix acquisition. She could have reported his practices months earlier but had waited, hoping he might change course voluntarily. Even now, facing the destruction of everything he had built, she was giving him a chance to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage. The weight of Vincent's choices pressed down on him as he considered Lucia's offer. He could accept his lawyer's advice and provide minimal cooperation designed to reduce his sentence, or he could follow her example and prioritize patient welfare over personal consequences. Friday morning brought Vincent's decision. He dismissed his legal team's objections and agreed to provide comprehensive testimony about pharmaceutical industry practices, including detailed evidence of collusion between major companies to suppress generic drug development and maintain artificial treatment scarcity. His testimony would implicate dozens of executives and result in industry-wide reforms that would make life-saving treatments more accessible to patients worldwide. The decision would likely result in harsher personal consequences for Vincent, but it would also prevent the kind of treatment suppression that had nearly destroyed Dr. Morgan's cancer research. Lucia attended Vincent's first day of congressional testimony, sitting in the public gallery as he detailed the systematic exploitation of desperate patients by an industry that prioritized quarterly profits over human lives. His testimony was devastating in its comprehensiveness, providing lawmakers with evidence needed to pass pharmaceutical reform legislation that had been stalled for years. The hearing concluded with Vincent's admission that his attempt to acquire Helix Pharmaceuticals represented everything wrong with an industry that viewed life-saving research as commodity to be controlled rather than knowledge to be shared. His words carried the weight of someone who had finally understood the human cost of his business practices. As Vincent left the congressional hearing room, he found Lucia waiting in the corridor. The woman he had tried to destroy stood ready to offer him something he had never given his own employees: respect and recognition for making the right choice, despite personal cost. "Dr. Benedetti," Vincent said, extending his hand. "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to choose integrity over self-interest." Lucia accepted his handshake with the dignity that had sustained her through 18 months of invisibility in his household. "The choice was always yours to make, Mr. Ashford. I'm glad you finally made it." 6 months later, Vincent was serving his sentence at a minimum security federal facility, his cooperation having resulted in the lightest possible punishment for his crimes. His testimony had led to the conviction of 17 pharmaceutical executives and the implementation of industry reforms that would save thousands of lives annually by ensuring faster development and distribution of generic medications. Lucia had accepted a position as Director of Ethical Pharmaceutical Development at a research institute funded by the European Consortium, where she worked to prevent the kind of research suppression that had nearly destroyed Dr. Morgan's cancer treatment. Her brother Marco had been among the first patients to benefit from the treatment that Vincent had tried to bury, and his successful recovery served as a daily reminder of why her moral courage had been necessary. The estate that had once symbolized Vincent's power over vulnerable employees had been sold to fund victim compensation programs for patients who had been denied access to affordable treatments due to pharmaceutical industry manipulation. The study where Vincent had conducted his most ruthless business dealings had been converted into a patient advocacy center, where people could receive help navigating the complex world of medical treatment access. Margaret Chen, who had witnessed the entire transformation, often reflected on how quickly absolute power could crumble when confronted by unwavering moral conviction. The woman who had cleaned Vincent's office while he plotted to suppress life-saving research had ultimately proven more powerful than the billionaire who had underestimated both her intelligence and her integrity. Dr. Morgan's cancer research continued to produce breakthrough results, with treatments now available to patients worldwide who would have been denied access under Vincent's suppression plan. The research institute where Lucia now worked had developed protocols to prevent the kind of corporate interference that had nearly destroyed years of life-saving work. The federal investigation that had begun with Lucia's whistleblowing had expanded to encompass the entire pharmaceutical industry, resulting in reforms that prioritized patient welfare over corporate profits. The courage of one woman who had risked everything to prevent the suppression of cancer research had ultimately transformed an industry that had exploited desperate patients for decades. Vincent's final letter to Lucia, written from his prison cell, acknowledged that she had saved not only Dr. Morgan's research and countless patient lives, but also his own soul by forcing him to confront the human cost of his business practices. He expressed gratitude for her decision to offer him a path to redemption even after he had tried to destroy her life, recognizing that her moral example had ultimately provided him with the only meaningful legacy he could leave. The story of their conflict had become a case study in business schools and medical ethics programs, illustrating how moral courage could triumph over institutional power when someone was willing to risk everything for principles greater than personal safety. Lucia's decision to expose Vincent's practices had demonstrated that true power lay not in the ability to control others, but in the willingness to act ethically, regardless of personal consequences. As Lucia continued her work developing ethical frameworks for pharmaceutical research, she carried with her the knowledge that individual moral choices could reshape entire industries when backed by unwavering commitment to human welfare over personal gain. The whispered warning in Italian that had once frozen Vincent's hand had ultimately unfrozen an entire system of exploitation that had prioritized profits over the fundamental human right to life-saving medical treatment. The transformation was complete, the justice served, and the lesson learned that in the end, moral courage would always prove more powerful than wealth, influence, or the ability to exploit those society had rendered invisible. Vincent's empire had crumbled, but from its ruins had emerged a more ethical approach to pharmaceutical development that would benefit generations of patients who would never know the name of the cleaning woman whose courage had saved their lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.